Madeleine McCann is the most famous missing person on Earth.
Everyone would love the story to have a happy ending. Everyone would love for Madeline to turn up safe and well.
For all of us in the media, this is one of the stories of the century.
It was all Maddie all the time. It was as though there was no other news.
I think the only story that's been bigger than the disappearance of Madeleine McCann has been the death of Princess Diana.
Her angelic face was a gift, and the McCanns ran a massive media campaign to keep her in the headlines and convince the world to keep looking for her.
Occasionally you'll meet people who say, oh, why don't the McCanns just shut up? And we get bored of hearing the McCann story, you know. Why don't they just stop talking about it? And I always say, how can you stop talking about it when you've lost your child?
But over the 7 years of the Find Maddie campaign, there have been dramatic and brutal backlashes.
But it did feel to the world of journalism sometimes as though we were being used.
When there was no news, the press struggled for stories.
Journalists were on the streets looking for stories, and they had to publish stories. They want something. It's top of the hour, and this is a big story, won't they? But there wasn't anything. So there was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, things started to get, shall I say, rather creative.
The monstering of the McCanns by the British media is one of the most shameful episodes of the British Free Press.
It was a story that would end up in the High Court, costing the British media hundreds of thousands of pounds in damages.
But I do think the British media sank below their usual fairly low standards.
I'm Martin Frizzell, and 7 years ago I broke a news story that would shatter a family's life and become one of the biggest mysteries of our generation. As editor of the country's biggest breakfast show when she disappeared, I was as keen as anyone to run the story. It brought in more viewers. They genuinely wanted to know what had happened. But children go missing all the time. What was it about this little girl that continues to obsess us 7 years on? It all started down below me here in Praia da Luz on the Algarve. And as this year marks the 7th anniversary of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, I returned to Portugal to tell you how her story became breaking news. On May the 4th, 2007, I was the editor of the country's most popular breakfast show, broadcasting to millions of viewers every day. It was a Friday. It was just after 8 a.m. and the mood was light-hearted.
Taking over the show. We were having a generally jokey moment on a Friday morning, and suddenly, and I think you can even see on the footage, I sort of go a bit like that, because the call came through in my earpiece saying, you're going to do an interview with a woman. She's really concerned about her friend. Her friend's child has gone missing and she's desperate for help. We got some more breaking news for you this morning. Very serious story is developing and is coming through to us. And it's that a 3-year-old British girl has gone missing in Portugal. We can speak now to Jill Rennick, who's a family friend. What can you tell us about what happened?
They were just, watching the hotel room and going back every half hour. And the shutters have been broken open and they've gone into the room and taken Madeline.
I was taking a punt with the story, but I suspected that it was going to be big.
If you as the editor hadn't been in the gallery giving the instructions, I'm not sure that the producer of the day would have put that call through to the studio, because it's such an unusual thing, it almost needed the kind of authority of the editor to say, let's do it.
They'd left about 8 and went back in at 9 and they were fine, and then back in at 10 and she was gone.
She mentioned that Kate, who she called her friend, was really worried and really panicked and frantic, as you would be. She mentioned that she didn't feel that anyone was really looking for Madeline at that time. And already I was thinking, God, this sounds awful, what's going on?
They're just having to wait till people help them. They've been looking themselves. They walked along the hedgerows and they've been out shouting, but there's nothing else they can do unless they get some support from the police over there or the police here.
Well, suddenly the mood of the whole show changed, I think, from that moment on air, that it wasn't a fun Friday moment. You were aware that something big was happening.
What do you remember about coming off air and what happened then?
you said, but I think you need to pack your bags, I think you've got to go out there, I'm going to go and see what's going on. So I did that essentially. I ran home and chucked some clothes in a bag and headed on out to Portugal.
My instincts had been right. The story that we just broke in was developing fast, and with Kate on her way to the airport, the news started to gain momentum with other TV bulletins and press. By lunchtime, it was headline news.
They checked on 3-year-old Madeline and the younger twins frequently, but on one of those checks, they found Madeline had gone.
I remember seeing the Maddie story on GMTV, first of all. And it just very quickly gained momentum. Some stories appear and then disappear quite quickly. But this one really had legs, I think, for any parent, well, anyone, but any parent, any mother of a child of that age. It kind of hit me in the chest, you know, in a way that not that many stories do.
It's hard to imagine any one story that could have more, could have ticked more boxes, rung more bells in the human psyche than this story. I mean, it's every parent's nightmare, big cliche, but it is true.
It had all the ingredients. It was a beautiful young girl, 2 devoted parents, 2 other siblings. You know, they were on holiday. They had that factor. It could have been any of us.
Here in this tiny Portuguese holiday seaside town, the locals and journalists had no idea what was about to hit them.
Children just don't go missing here. This is Praia de Luz. This is a little sleepy, family-friendly village. What's gone wrong? What's happened?
This was about to become one of the biggest news events of the decade. On GMTV, our viewers were glued to this story. But the media and the public would come to be divided on a global scale.
They were told by child abduction experts, if you cry on television, they told Kate, the kidnapper might get off on that.
In May 2007, GMTV broke the story of the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. I was its editor, and now I'm back in Portugal to find out what was it about this story that gripped the world's media. So then the ball had started rolling on one of the biggest news stories of the decade, the story of a little girl who would become the most famous missing person on Earth. Local journalist Paul Luckman was one of the first on the scene.
It just seemed to catch everybody's imagination in a matter of hours, really. I would think there's film crews from nearly everywhere in the world were here. It spread like wildfire.
For this sleepy village, our news team and hundreds of other journalists would transform the idyllic lifestyle forever. What was the scene that greeted you when you arrived back home?
You couldn't move around the area, around where the supermarket is and where the apartment was. You couldn't drive. I'd drive through there. You couldn't. There were vans, cameras, journalists, police, obviously, everywhere. The whole area was just swamped.
It was pretty chaotic. I mean, within the first 2 days, there was a bank of cameras and reporters all the way down the road, all lined up, all reporting in, 20 different languages.
When I drove into Praia de Luz from the airport, I mean, the roads were absolutely jammed with crews of all nationalities. And you look around and you think, oh, I recognise that correspondent. Oh, I recognise that news anchor. All of them standing in the shade, waiting for something to happen.
We went to have a look around the resort, and Kate and Jerry McCann came out and walked down the road, and everyone was just, well, first of all, we didn't know who she was initially, and then someone said, that's her, that's the mother. So we ran over to start filming, and immediately the police were there and saying, don't approach them, don't approach them. And they started to walk down to the little church on the seafront, presumably to say prayers. And it was very eerie, because your instinct as a journalist was to run up and to say what's going on, but the whole press pack didn't do it for some reason.
24 hours after Madeline disappeared, Kate and Jerry McCann delivered their first ever news conference.
The first time the McCann couple talked to us, journalists, was in the night of that May the 4th. and that moment was already big confusion. A lot of journalists, a lot of people. We understood it was really a major story.
They emerged, and it was just very chilling. And everyone was very quiet, very respectful, listened to what they had to say.
Words cannot describe the anguish and despair that we are feeling as the parents of our beautiful daughter Madeline. We request that anyone who may have any information related to Madeline's disappearance, no matter how trivial, contact the Portuguese police and help us get her back safely.
The McCanns were moved out of their apartment and it was sealed off by police. They vowed not to leave Portugal without their daughter. They set up camp in another house in Praia da Luz and the press camped with them. The world's media reported what they thought had happened to Madeline by talking to her parents, friends and family. To begin with, there was consensus. Every journalist accepted their story. They told us that they'd arrived at the Ocean Club in Praia da Luz on the 28th of April 2007 and stayed at apartment 5A, Rua Agostinho da Silva, which they had booked for a 7-night break. The apartments are privately owned and let, but guests have access to the leisure and restaurant facilities at the club. On the 3rd of May, the McCanns were with friends who came to be known as the Tapas 7. The parents left their apartment at 8:30 to go for dinner with friends at the Ocean Club's Tapas Bar. That's it, over my shoulder, just 50 metres or so across the pool from apartment 5A. And regularly, they and their friends would go back and check on the children. The patio doors locked from the inside, so the McCanns left the doors unlocked to allow them to enter that way. Kate McCann said that at around 10 o'clock that evening it had been her turn to check on the children. She said she remembered entering the apartment through the patio doors and noticed that the children's bedroom door was wide open. When she tried to close the door, it slammed shut as though there was a draft. And when she opened the door again, she noticed that the bedroom window and its shutter were wide open. Madeline's cuddle cat and pink blanket were still on the bed, but Madeline was gone. Kate McCann said she was convinced Madeline had been abducted and that she sprinted back to the restaurant screaming, "She's gone, she's gone." The Ocean Club's manager said that 60 staff and guests searched until the early hours but found nothing. Though the police now admit they made mistakes such as failing to secure the McCann's apartment and protect the scene of the crime, their response to Madeline's disappearance was unprecedented.
An amazing turn-up by the Portuguese authorities. I was absolutely amazed at it when I got there to see the extent to which they'd gone. And we were talking police, firemen, civil defence. They'd had the search dogs, the mountain search dogs brought from north of Portugal. I mean, it was an amazing effort, but of course everybody, all of us, thought we were looking for a child that had wandered away.
For us at GMTV and most of the press, the fact that the McCanns were educated and both doctors made it all the more fascinating. But not surprisingly, neither had ever had to deal with the media before. At first, the representatives of the holiday company helped them out. We are grateful to all of those currently taking part in the search for our daughter Madeline. It was just 2 days since Madeline's disappearance, but the McCanns' relationship with the media was already starting to fracture.
I think maybe some of the Portuguese press almost felt, or the way it was written, almost made it seem like they were almost being insulted by having so many people there. I think they didn't want to think something bad had happened on their patch.
And Portuguese public opinion was equally divided.
In Portugal, we are more protective of children. We wouldn't leave home leaving your child over there sleeping alone. Even if you are close, you wouldn't do that. Nobody understood pretty well why the prosecutor didn't want to charge the McCanns for neglect.
They couldn't understand why a child wouldn't be with its parents at dinner, because the Mediterranean way or the Portuguese way would be to have all the children with you if you were out at a tapas bar. So they didn't understand that, but mostly I think they just didn't believe that that could happen. They just didn't believe it.
The rules of exchange between the police and the press are very different in Portugal than in Britain. João Tiago is a journalist who's worked for both Portuguese and British media.
The idea in Portugal is that quiet investigations are more effective than, investigations with a lot of publicity. So what they do, they have the law secrecy status, and that law secrecy status don't allow police to talk about the content of the investigation. So they can say we are investigating this, the first signs of the crime were this and that, but they don't go much further.
3 days after Madeline's disappearance, the McCanns felt like not enough was being done to find their daughter, and they wanted to know why. Madeline was front-page news again, and in an unprecedented move, the British government flew a media expert to Praia da Luz to advise them.
I can't ever remember where the government has acted as a PR advisor stroke minder for a family in a situation like this. This is just one of the factors that make this story so extraordinary.
The McCann's mission was to keep Madeline in the papers and on our TVs. At the start we had unparalleled access to the McCanns, however difficult it seemed for them.
You had this incredible face of Kate McCann, and I find it difficult. We've seen so many grief-stricken mothers, but there was something about her face that it was like every woman, it was etched on her.
I was as desperate as anyone to find out what was happening, but like many journalists at the time, I was also becoming aware of the McCann's media campaign.
Jerry is he probably wasn't always this way, I'm guessing. But he is now, or at least was when I interviewed him, very rigid, very stern, very defensive. They were told by child abduction experts, if you cry on television, they told Kate, the kidnapper might get off on that, horrible though that sounds. So she had to keep a stoic face on television. She couldn't weep, she couldn't look distraught, and so she looked kind of like a robot. She looked mechanical, not only, to her friends or in Praia da Luz, but all over the world on TV and on the internet and in newspapers. So that backfired because everybody, including the police in Portugal, including the news outlets, were saying, how come the mother isn't crying? Her child is missing.
When people say to me, she was too composed, I think she was not composed. She wasn't composed at all. She was absolutely distraught, but she just wasn't doing it in a very overt way. She was holding it together. And they often say, don't judge us until you've walked in our shoes. You don't know how you would be if your child was taken.
The McCanns were at a crossroads. The police wouldn't talk to them, the press were starting to report rumours, and their little girl was still missing. It was now that they decided to take hold of the campaign themselves. The government became concerned with the rumour mill too, and flew out the former journalist Clarence Mitchell from the Cabinet Office to advise the couple. And the McCanns hired their own personal PR expert, former parliamentary candidate and friend Justine McGuinness.
You can see how the McCanns reached the conclusion that they did, that they were desperate about their daughter. They didn't want the trail to go cold. They needed a huge amount of attention. They needed the police pressure to be brought on the police to do everything they could. It will have struck them that professional PR would be the right way to do it, and in many ways it was. But the sheer professionalism of it, I think, troubled journalists.
The McCann's public relations team would try to control every move that the McCanns made and every word they spoke. But public relations on this scale is a huge challenge.
We have a flash here from the Press Association Newswire saying that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car crash in Paris.
Michael Cole was responsible for handling the press on an equally major story. Dodi Al-Fayed and Princess Diana were killed in a car crash in 1997.
You, I hope, never lose sight of your own humanity. You never lose sight of what the story is, but you do not disregard the perfectly legitimate interest that the media has. Sometimes they don't express it terribly well, sometimes they can be a bit difficult, but they have a legitimate job and they have to be treated with respect.
9 days after her disappearance, Madeline turned 4 years old. In her hometown of Rothley in Leicestershire, an all-night vigil was held. In Portugal, her Catholic parents attended another mass. Madeline was continuing to make news all over the world.
People talked about Madeleine McCann in the United States not only as though she were an American child, but as though she lived next door, as though she played with their own toddlers. People were very intimately involved in the lives of the McCanns from the moment this story became public.
There's no doubt that one of the things that made the Madeline story so newsworthy was the fact that she was this beautiful little girl, even down to her slightly unusual eye.
But running a campaign on this scale is expensive. 12 days after Madeline's disappearance, the McCanns launched a fundraising campaign. The fund's website had 58 million hits within just 2 days of launch, and the cash started to pour in. The fund received pledges of £250,000 from the News of the World, the same amount from Sir Philip Green, £50,000 by Simon Cowell, and £25,000 from Colleen Rooney. And some more famous faces went on television to appeal for help.
I was very upset to hear of the abduction of Madeleine McCann. I appeal to anyone with information to come forward. Please come forward.
But the search for Madeline had stalled. The price of keeping her in the headlines meant that sightings were reported from all over the world, but they were all red herrings. There was still no sign of Madeline 2 weeks after she'd gone missing, but the McCanns, their PR people and the press craved new information, a breakthrough every day. The McCann's PR machine recognised the need to keep Madeline in the public eye and made sure there was always something fresh for us to report.
Journalists had no news. Many days that nothing was happening. Police was not giving new leads. Police was not giving anything new, and the McCanns had to create things. Create not fake things, of course, but they would set up walks on Praia da Luz. They would set up, you know, tomorrow we are doing something, you may shoot.
One of the masterstrokes of the McCann's PR team was to arrange a meeting with the Pope. This would normally take years, but just 22 days after she went missing, Kate and Jerry McCann were in his presence in Rome.
I think unconsciously people recognise that they are in some way being spoon-fed, and they don't like it. And if poor Mr. and Mrs. McCann have experienced any sort of hostility from the public, and they have, and it's been awful and completely undeserved, it will partly be because the public have noticed, perhaps unconsciously, that the campaign has been being run in too professional a manner.
And some sections of the press were beginning to notice a change in public opinion.
Her disappearance divided the nation on class lines, because I lost count of the number of people who wrote to me and said, you know, if she had been the daughter of, you know, a couple of unemployed people living in Liverpool, she would have been off the front pages in a matter of days.
Even at GMTV, we realised how important the story was to our viewers. We reported every development and ran spin-off updates whenever we could. We knew that Madeline's story was huge, but then each year 500 to 600 children are reported missing in Britain. On the 4th of May 2003, 4 years to the day before the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, 7-year-old Daniel Entwistle from Great Yarmouth arrived home on his bike, having run an errand for his mother.
He came back from the shop with a baby's bottle. He said, "Dad, can I have some money for some sweets?" I gave him some money for sweets, but he never bought any. They've got him on camera in the shop, but he never bought any sweets.
Just after 5 p.m, Daniel went back out on his bicycle, but was never seen again.
They've got Daniel on camera going past the garage. And that's the last sighting of him at 17 minutes past 5. We went round Yarmouth looking for him. Couldn't find him. The search went on a couple of hours, and then we rang the police. Police come and he just went on from there.
Norfolk police mounted a huge search for Daniel, and the media took a keen interest.
Police are still treating this as a missing persons inquiry, but the search is being widened.
The police investigation continued, but after a few days and with no donations and no PR campaign, there was nothing new to report. So we and the rest of the media quietly stopped covering it. It's the nature of news that other stories are developing all the time. 11 years on, Daniel's still missing.
I've got 110% respect for Madeline. I hope she does get found. But I can't understand why they're in the paper every couple of days.
If you're a missing person, you shouldn't be a boy, black or working class. I find it very worrying that journalists and editors go down the route of being particularly selective about the missing children that they focus on.
Feels like to me it's favouritism, because they're up there and they're campaigning, they're getting money here, there and left, right and centre.
Middle class people are better at arousing interest and at keeping attention focused. Sometimes they have the levers at their disposal that working class people don't.
Neither Daniel nor Madeline had any control over their backgrounds or upbringing. And this is my dilemma. The media has the final say on who gets their attention and why, and it all comes down to selling papers, gaining readership, and for us, connecting with the viewers and winning the ratings war.
There's no doubt that any new development with regard to the Madeleine McCann case would sell newspapers, 70,000 extra, 80,000 extra, whatever it was, a considerable number.
I think it's obvious that the media was far more interested in circulation and viewership than the fate of this poor little girl. It was something that every media outlet wanted for themselves. They wanted 30,000 extra newspapers on a daily basis. They wanted 2 million extra viewers, and they got them.
As a father and a television producer, I was concerned about the fate of this missing little girl, but there's no doubt her story sold papers and boosted ratings. By early June, and with no real new news to report, the media started asking tougher questions. The fragile relationship between Kate and Jerry and the press started to break down.
The British media loves to sell newspapers, loves to gain viewers, and how do you do that? You implicate the parents.
A month on from disappearing, and by early June 2007, there was still no sign of Madeline. Her parents were still in Portugal, and developments in the case were few and far between. But by now, my team at GMTV and the press were under intense pressure to deliver something original and fresh every day. Rumour, innuendo, conspiracy theory was rife on the internet, and the British and Portuguese press reported it.
You've got your editors baying for, it's almost the top of the hour, I've got to have a news story, I've got a new liners, I need something on this. But there wasn't anything, so there was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, things started to get, shall I say, rather creative. And the Portuguese police, when they eventually realised that they're going to have to say something, which, as I say, normally they wouldn't do and they're not permitted to do, they were handling a situation that was really outside their experience.
The rumours came mainly from the Portuguese police, who were leaking to their own press. When they ran the stories, sections of the British media simply reran them. The McCanns were furious, but they would do anything to keep Madeline in the headlines.
The reason the press worldwide was involved in this story, from all over the world, is because Jerry McCann made it his business to, as he put it to me in an interview with me, market his child. He called it the marketing of Madeleine McCann. And this, of course, was the act of a very desperate father. I cannot tell you that it worked perfectly. It worked very imperfectly, but it worked.
The sole objective of Jerry and Kate McCann was to keep their daughter's face in the newspapers and on television. That was their sole objective because they knew that would be the best way of finding her.
6 weeks after Madeline vanished, there had been several suspects, a handful of sightings, dozens of rumours, but few facts. But every new development in the case kept Madeline on the front pages of the tabloids and the top of the news bulletins.
Murat can be seen chatting to police officers as he projected himself as a local man helping investigators.
Robert Murat was made an official suspect by the Portuguese police. The house he shared with his mother was raided and the press went to town.
The press talked itself into a state of hysteria, but believed that they might have found the right person, and then reported that belief as though there was much more credence could be attached to it than ever could. In a sense, it was an innocent mistake, in that hysteria is an innocent mistake, but still it was hysterical and it was unprofessional.
The McCanns stayed out of the spotlight on the story, never commenting on it officially. But Robert Murat and his family were chased by the British media for months. Kate and Jerry McCann would be next. In mid-July, 9 weeks after Madeline's disappearance, British sniffer dogs trained to smell blood and dead bodies were called in to examine the McCann's apartment and hire car. The apartment had been sealed off since Madeline went missing, and corpse odour was apparently discovered in the McCann's bedroom by the wardrobe, in the living room behind a sofa, and outside on the veranda, and in a flower bed. And a car that the McCanns had hired to spread the word of the campaign 25 days after Madeline's disappearance was also apparently found to have corpse odour in the boot. The press had a field day. What followed was a sustained, inaccurate and malicious series of headlines in newspapers suggesting somehow that the McCanns had been involved with the death of their own daughter. We can't show you those headlines, but they were so cruel that even the Chief Constable of Leicestershire himself appealed to the press twice to show restraint, but not all of them did.
The monstering of the McCanns by the British media is one of the most shameful episodes of the British Free Press. It should not have happened. Perhaps it was the heat of the Algarve sun, or the fact that they were a long way from Fleet Street. A collective madness seemed to afflict the whole of the British press corps.
128 days after Madeline disappeared, the media had the massive story they'd been waiting for. On September the 8th, the McCanns were hit by a bombshell. Having been interviewed separately by Portuguese police, they were made arguidos, suspects.
I think people were baffled, and I think by that point there was such an appetite for the story, and I think it just created, in a sense, a new direction to take the story. Whether or not you believed it was true, it was a whole new area.
The police, I think, pretty clearly said, I think it will be a good time to go home now. And once they'd gone home, that was a day of, shall we say, quite frenetic activity as they left the house, the villa they were then staying in, and drove to the airport. And once they'd gone, it started to wind down.
I can remember as I drove back to the airport almost feeling like I betrayed them, because I was accepting that they were slipping from the top of the news agenda. And it felt like a terrible act of betrayal to be leaving Portugal without them being found, without Madeline being found.
4 months and 11 days after the start of their family holiday, the McCanns packed their bags and flew home as chief suspects in the disappearance of their daughter Madeline. Within days they were turned on by some of the media, who reported any story they could find, however far-fetched.
Look, they were the ones who hauled the press in the first place. They were the ones who kept the press going whenever things got quiet. So let's put it this way. The McCanns were in bed with a very, very difficult ally. And they hated the ally, but they needed the ally.
But the McCanns fought back. Clarence Mitchell quit his post in the government's cabinet office to become the McCanns' full-time spokesperson.
I will simply be representing Kate and Jerry as a private individual, one who believes utterly that they are entirely innocent of any involvement in the disappearance, let alone the death, of their daughter Madeline.
But this move also fueled the suspicion.
A lot of people think that public relations or having a spokesman is some sort of penicillin. It's not. Public relations only works if a product is good.
The McCanns seem to be losing the campaign. Sections of the press were more interested in them as suspects than looking for Madeline. But despite the negative coverage, the McCanns fought on. There's no doubt that news about Madeleine McCann, however contentious or libelous, sold newspapers and increased ratings. As editors, it's an incredibly fine line that we tread.
You ask whether editors deliberately perpetuated the story. I don't think it was a cynical decision. It's not like, yeah, this is great telly, let's keep it going. It was a story that kind of begged to be covered, because there was always something happening. There was always something new, a development that you could find, and this incredible mystery at its heart, which still goes on.
In evidence given to the government's Culture, Media and Sport Committee, the former editor of the Daily Express confirmed that running stories about Madeline increased their circulation by many thousands a day. But he rejected fabricating stories just to increase sales.
The competition brings out the good, but unfortunately the downside is that in the straining to be first and the straining to get scoops, they can push the boundaries, ethical boundaries, far beyond where they should be.
Until Madeline went missing, newspaper sales across the board were in decline. But between April and June 2007, the period when Madeline went missing, average monthly readership of the Daily Star rose by over 25,000. The Mirror rose by almost 30,000. Whether or not the rise was as a result of splashing with stories about Madeleine McCann is open to debate. What isn't, though, is that some papers paid a heavy price for their obsession. In March 2008, the McCanns sued for libel. They singled out the Daily Express and its sister newspaper, the Daily Star, as well as their Sunday stablemates. It was a high-risk but effective warning shot to the rest of the media. Despite their campaign's objectives, the McCanns were prepared to fight the press if they continued to make up stories about them.
I think to myself, you know, as a former popular newspaper editor myself and a long-time advocate of tabloid journalism, that it was one of the worst periods in our history.
On March the 19th, the McCanns accepted £500,000 of libel damages and front-page apologies from Express Group newspapers.
Overall, long-term trend made no difference whatsoever. And later you could say that it helped to eat into their credibility. So I think it was a bad episode, a huge mistake.
The McCanns sued the Express to make an example of them, but the broadsheets also flew close to the wind.
Broadsheet press often pick up on the salacious stories that tabloids do and simply treat them in a different way that makes their readers feel better about themselves because they believe that they're analysing the story rather than showing a kind of unhealthy interest in the story.
On the first anniversary of the disappearance of Madeline, the McCanns attended a church service in their hometown of Rothley. In Praia da Luz, the media waited for the McCann family and friends to leave the Portuguese church service and release balloons in memory of Madeline. Once again, Praia da Luz was invaded by TV crews and journalists, and the cameras would return year upon year.
He thinks if he works hard enough, he can get Madeline back. And if he doesn't get her back, it's because he hasn't worked hard enough.
On the 1st of July 2008, 423 days after the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the Portuguese police halted their investigation. 3 weeks later, the arguido status against the McCanns and Robert Murat was lifted. Robert Murat won damages and apologies from 11 British newspapers.
I'm normally pretty robust in defending the press, knocking anybody around a bit in their search for the truth. But I do think the British media sank below their usual fairly low standards in the treatment of Robert Murat.
Kate and Jerry McCann suffered the tragedy of losing their daughter while on holiday, the horror of being named suspects by the Portuguese police, and the despair of the media accusing them of her murder. But now they were free of accusation. They could concentrate again on their campaign to find Madeline. They needed to keep her in the public eye.
I've interviewed Kate and Jerry, I guess, probably 4 or 5 times. And I said to Jerry that what I always say about him is that I believe that he thinks if he works hard enough, he can get Madeline back. And if he doesn't get her back, it's because he hasn't worked hard enough. And he kind of said, yeah.
In July 2008, they were hit with another shock. The lead detective on the original investigation released a book claiming Madeline was dead and the McCanns were somehow involved. They managed to get the book banned and are still pursuing its author for libel through the Portuguese courts. Over 2 years after Madeline went missing, a new suspect was revealed. But like all those before, it came to nothing. The suspect was never found. But the McCann's media campaign continued to pounce on the slimmest of leads. On the 5th anniversary of her disappearance, Madeline's parents released an age-processed image of her and went on TV to talk about it.
I think we're more hopeful now of finding Madeline than we have been at any point since the early days.
On what would have been Madeline's 8th birthday in 2011, the McCanns released their own book, which addressed some of the criticism they'd received since she disappeared. The following year, British detectives launched their own investigation and said they had genuinely new lines of inquiry, believing there was a chance Madeline was still alive.
It feels as though the British police are trying to unravel kind of a spaghetti of information from those early days. And so, yeah, it still feels like there's a constant cycle of hope and confusion and disappointment and frustration, really, very similar to we had in those first few hours and days.
7 years on, we still have no idea what happened to Madeleine McCann. But her mother and father are as determined as ever to keep her memory alive.
Police today confirm they're looking for a man who sneaked into...
With every news story that emerges, the McCanns are back in the spotlight, and Madeleine's back in the news.
They've had more exposure, both positive and negative, than any other couple I can think of, any other story that I can think of. The things that made them very appealing to the press in the early days worked against them eventually. The fact that Kate is beautiful and photogenic and articulate, and Jerry is articulate and, you know, focused.
Apart from the death of Princess Diana, I can't remember another story that has stayed so much in the psyche of people. And I find it hard to imagine, you know, even all these years later, we still pray that Madeline will be found alive. There is still hope. And I think as long as that hope is there, it will go on to be one of the biggest stories of my lifetime.
People initially said they seemed too good to be true. But actually, they've turned out to be that graceful and that lovely. And so maybe that's why we've stuck with it.
Madeleine McCann's parents have achieved what they set out to keep their daughter's face on the front pages and in the headlines until she's found. So why is Madeleine McCann still on the front pages all these years on? Sure, the story sells newspapers, it boosts ratings, but it's because you want to know, whether it's because of your cynicism of the McCanns and the way they've marketed their daughter, because it's the unsolved mystery, because perhaps it's every parent's worst nightmare, or there but for the grace of God go I. Whatever the reason, you'd have to have a cold heart indeed not to wish closure on this for the McCanns. And that story, the eventual discovery of Madeline, will be the biggest yet.
Tonight at 9 here on Channel 5, we follow the staff and patients at the neonatal unit at the Liverpool Women's Hospital, where fragile lives hang in the balance in new miracle babies. Next, though, there's a rhino in my bed, and he doesn't half snore.